All right, today we're cracking open one of the greatest, honest-to-goodness, unsolved mysteries of the Canadian North. It's a story about a lone fugitive, an absolutely epic chase, and a secret identity that stayed buried under ice and snow for decades. Our guide for this whole thing is Dick North's incredible investigation, The Mad Trapper of Rat River. And let me tell you, it is a deep dive into a manhunt that became a total legend, and the detective work that finally gave a name to a ghost. You really have to picture this. This wasn't just some local crime story. We're talking the winter of 1932, right in the thick of the Great Depression. This was front-page news. People were literally glued to their radios, hanging on every word about this hunt. He was this lone man against all the authorities, a rugged individualist at a time when so many people felt powerless. The fascination was just enormous. So here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, we'll meet the phantom who just sort of appeared in the Arctic. Then we'll get into the massive manhunt he started. After that, we'll explore the legend he became. And finally, we'll see how a cold case investigation, decades later, finally unmasked the guy. Okay, so our story really kicks off in July 1931. A man shows up at Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories. He was quiet, had these cold blue eyes, and he called himself Albert Johnson. He knew exactly what he wanted, paid for everything in cash, and really just kept to himself, building a tiny cabin on the Rat River to wait out the winter. From the very beginning, he was a total phantom.
So how does a quiet loner end up the subject of Canada's biggest manhunt? Well, it started pretty simply, actually, just a complaint from some local trappers. But when the Mounties came knocking to ask a few questions, they were met with gunfire. And with that one single shot, an unbelievable chase across the frozen north was on.
And just look at this timeline. It shows you how relentless this chase was, lasting 48 days in the dead of winter. It starts when Johnson shoots a constable, which leads to a 15-hour siege on his cabin, a cabin that was basically a fortress. And incredibly, he escapes. The hunt gets more and more intense, and a month later, Johnson kills another officer, Constable Millen. At that point, for the Mounties, it got personal. The big takeaway here is just his sheer resilience. The guy seemed unstoppable. And he did all of this, in conditions that are almost impossible to wrap your head around. The temperature with the wind chill could plummet to 75 degrees below zero. I mean, the posse chasing him had dog teams and supplies. Johnson? He had a rifle, a pack on his back, and this almost superhuman ability to just endure the cold and give his trackers the slip. The hunt got so desperate that the Mounties did something they'd never done before. They called in an airplane. The legendary World War I flying ace Walt May was hired to spot this guy from the air. This was a huge moment. You've got the old world of tracking on foot clashing with modern technology, all to catch one man. So on February 17th, 1932, the chase finally came to an end. Johnson was cornered on the frozen Eagle River and killed in a shootout. But when the posse got to his body, they found nothing. No ID, no papers, nothing. The man they had chased for nearly 2 months across hundreds of miles was a complete and total unknown. The manhunt was over, sure, but the real mystery? It was just beginning. And this is all they had to go on. These grainy, pretty haunting photos of him after he died were circulated all across the continent. Who was this man? Where did he come from? Why would he fight to the death instead of just surrendering? With zero answers, the public's imagination just ran wild. And oh man, the theories were incredible. I mean, straight out of movies and pulp novels. Was he a Russian spy? A Chicago mobster hiding out? Maybe an ex-Mountie with a score to settle? Or was he just a simple trapper who went mad from the isolation, cabin fever? Without a name or a past, Albert Johnson became this blank slate for everybody's fears and fantasies. And for 50 years, the case just went completely cold. The legend got bigger and bigger, but the man stayed a mystery. Then, researchers like Dick North started the painstaking work of digging through old records, tracking down witnesses who were long gone, and piecing together a trail that had been frozen in time. And this was the first huge break in the case. Researchers found records of a guy named Arthur Nelson who was in the Yukon right before Albert Johnson showed up. A trader remembered him, saying Nelson claimed he was from North Dakota and had worked in the mines. But here's the kicker. His physical description was a perfect match for the Mad Trapper. The ghost finally had a new name. So, following this Arthur Nelson lead all the way back to North Dakota, investigators finally landed on a name that fit. John Conrad Johnson. He wasn't some master spy or a big city gangster. Nope, he was something older, a product of the harsh American Badlands, an outlaw forged in the last days of the Wild West, with a history of crime and a lifetime of knowing how to survive brutal conditions. This timeline basically reveals a life lived on the absolute fringes of the law. Born in Norway, came to the US as a boy. As a teenager, he robs a bank. He does hard time in prison. He gets out, gets arrested again for stealing horses. This was not a man who was afraid of a fight, and he clearly had very good reasons to avoid the law at all costs.
And when you compare the two men, it's uncanny. The Mad Trapper was known as quiet, antisocial. People who knew John Conrad Johnson said he almost never spoke, just stood alone at dances. The Trapper was an expert shot, with unbelievable endurance. John was a crack shot, raised in the brutal Dakota winters. Even the physical descriptions, the height, the stooped posture, it all just lined up perfectly.
For decades, a photo of John Conrad Johnson was the one missing piece. Investigators finally dug up this prison photo of him, and when you put it next to an enhanced image of the man they called Arthur Nelson, who everyone believed was the Trapper, the resemblance is pretty striking. But the real proof comes when you put them together. And there it is. That's the moment the cold case just cracked wide open. When you overlay the two photos, you see an almost perfect match in the facial structure. The nose, the chin, the brow line. In a case this old, this is about as close as you can get to a smoking gun. The Phantom of the Arctic finally had a face.
So what's the final verdict here? We've got a name, we've got a criminal record, and we've got a near-perfect photo match. All the evidence points to one conclusion. Albert Johnson, the Mad Trapper of Rat River, was John Conrad Johnson, a small-time outlaw who brought the dying spirit of the Wild West with him for one final, violent standoff in the Canadian Arctic.
But maybe the most compelling piece of evidence isn't a photo, but this one small human detail. A woman who knew John when he was just a boy remembered his shy, awkward posture, how he'd always look at the ground, kind of peering up from under his eyebrows. It's the exact same shy way of carrying himself that people in the Yukon noticed decades later, connecting that quiet boy to the deadly fugitive. So in the end, who was he really? A vicious cop killer who got what was coming to him? Or was he something else? Maybe the last lonely ghost of the Wild West, a man totally out of time, running from his past and fighting one final desperate battle against a world that was closing in on him. That's the question the legend really leaves us with.